back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. Detective Dan Hankey talking about some of the activity that he thought was quite suspicious in the QuickBooks account of victim Joseph McStay following his disappearance. To delve a little bit deeper into this, let's turn to a report by Aaron Keller.
How does this family of four disappear off the face of the earth?
California small business owner Joseph McStay and his entire family disappeared February 4th, 2010. Their car was abandoned near the border. Authorities believed this video showed them fleeing to Mexico, presumably to avoid business debts. Case closed? Not even close. Fast forward more than 3 years to November 2013. A biker discovered the skull of one of the family members in the Mojave Desert.
I was traveling on a dirt road. I stumbled across the remains.
All four were buried nearby. Authorities arrested Chase Merritt, a business associate to Joseph McStay. They believe he killed for money.
The why boils down to greed and greed's child, fraud.
The defense says Merritt didn't do it.
Charles Merritt, which everybody calls Chase, that was his best friend.
The state has presented a $4,000 check from McStay to Merritt, made out the day McStay disappeared. But Merritt never cashed it. He told police there was always money and merchandise moving back and forth between him and McStay, since they frequently did business together.
Someone calls you and indicates that they are Joseph McStay.
Someone with at least some access to McStay's business accounts tried to change his QuickBooks software right after McStay vanished. The state also presented cell phone searches for information about the family's disappearance, made by Merritt, shortly after the family's bodies turned up in the desert. In those graves, a hammer prosecutors believe was the murder weapon. Also, shards of a bath mat. Authorities think it matches linens missing from the family's home.
They were beaten about the head and face until they died.
The family's home, prosecutors say, is the crime scene, but evidence is scant.
You will look for things, signs of violence, correct?
Yes.
And you didn't see any of them?
No, sir.
One officer who took photographs there realized back at the lab that she may have found blood on the family's table, but she didn't see it when she was in the house, and it was cleaned before anyone knew it was there.
When I saw it, I was horrified.
Why?
Because I thought it was something I missed.
The defense is pointing to an alternate suspect who also did business with the family and to unknown DNA found in the family's graves. This is Aaron Keller reporting for the Law and Crime Network.
Okay, so to dissect this case, this fascinating case that we're covering out of California, I want to bring in Pate, a criminal defense attorney out of Atlanta, and Marnie Jo Snyder, also a criminal defense attorney, remains with me on the line. I thought Aaron did a really nice job of summarizing where we've gotten so far in this case. Particularly, we also heard some testimony. It was a bit dry, I must admit, for Detective Dan Hankey about the importance of this QuickBooks testimony. I want to take it first to Paige. How important is that to the case?
Well, Rachel, obviously the prosecution is relying on that evidence very heavily to establish some sort of motive, a reason for Merritt to kill this family. But ultimately, I think it's really thin. I mean, perhaps he tried to take some money from McStay. Perhaps there were problems in their business dealings together. But that's a long way from proving that he killed this family. And the absence of any conclusive DNA evidence at the scene, either of the alleged murder or at the scene of where they were buried, I think really casts enough reasonable doubt in this case where it's going to be very hard for the prosecution to get a conviction, much less the death penalty.
Let's talk about this too, because you talk about the alleged, I put in quotes, murder scene of being the home of this family, the McStay family home. But you delve into this, and we're going to get into some of this testimony, and there's not a whole lot establishing from the get-go, Marnie Jo, that the murder even occurred at this home.
Right. It's just bath mat fiber, if I'm remembering that testimony correctly, that they're saying might have been the same as certain linens that were at the home. I think I remember fairly well the person that testified.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Marnie. No, I mean, this, according to the medical examiner, that's the home right there, this was a brutal killing, okay? These people were bludgeoned to death with that sledgehammer. And there was no trace, nothing, Paige, of any blood found at that home. Now, they pointed to this table. However, nothing was ever tested there, so that's not conclusive either.
No, it's incredible, Rachel. I mean, obviously, given the nature of this crime, the investigators are going to scour the scene of that house to try to find some evidence that the murders occurred there and perhaps some evidence as to who did it. We know they looked, and we also know they really didn't find anything. So I think their theory is really shaky, and a good defense team will certainly be able to poke enough holes in it so that the jury, I think, will have a really tough time convicting him.
Let's talk a little bit about how the bodies were discovered and the fact that the prosecution is trying to say, point the finger solely at Charles Merritt as being the one that did this crime. Because you'll remember, just to give you a little bit of background to our viewers, of course, the family disappeared in 2010. The police, the investigators, had really characterized this as a case of a family that just basically fled to Mexico. They thought they had some surveillance footage of a family of four crossing the border, and they didn't really investigate this as a case of foul play. Then 2013 rolls around. That biker you heard from on the stand says he finds the bodies, a shallow grave, and he finds the bodies of these four individuals. Given how brutally they were killed, Marnie, do you find it hard to believe, or perhaps you buy the prosecution's theory that one person was able to do this?
Yeah, I actually didn't at first, and we don't know. I think that it's really hard to imagine one person killing those people and also moving all their bodies completely undetected, when we already know that law enforcement was looking at border cameras, things like that, methods of travel. So the hunt for this family seems like it was on fairly early, and one person kills four people and is entirely undetected on the way down in that review. It seems unlikely to me. They're going to have to give us more as to why they think that could have happened and in what order it could have happened, how that went down.
Paige, do you think, because this is something the defense has tried to say, that this is a case of basically really a botched investigation because police investigators approached this in 2010 as a missing person case? They did not suspect foul play. They didn't really see anything out of the ordinary at the house that would raise to the level of this being some kind of crime. Do you think that could have really set police detectives back in their investigation?
Well, it's possible, but I don't think it's because the investigation was botched. I just think it's because there's very little evidence to tie Charles Merritt to this murder. But then they're stuck with a, brutally killed family, a lovely family that were tragically murdered by someone. So you can understand the prosecution's desire to bring a case, to even ask for the death penalty, and to charge the person they think is most likely the guy who did it. But that doesn't make their case any stronger. No matter how much they want to convict someone, they still have to gather the evidence necessary to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And I just, so far, haven't seen that in this trial.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network, but when we come back, we're going to delve more into the McStay family murders, hearing from neighbors. Did they hear anything suspicious the day the family was allegedly bludgeoned to death? Stay with us.
I don't know if it did, I don't think it did, which is why they pulled it out on a hard drive. Or the other thing.
When you switched it to motion detection, did you ever have a chance to go back and look and see how much recording you could save on your hard drive after you switched?
Yes, it would go back about a few, I would say a few, so 3 or 4 months.
So you doubled your time.
Okay, so that's a neighbor of the McStay family talking about she had not really, the day that they went missing, she did not hear or see anything suspicious. She heard no loud noises. I want to bring in Paige Pate and also Marnie Jo Snyder, who are both with me via Skype. Paige, how important is a witness like this's testimony?
Well, it's important to the defense in this case because, as you pointed out earlier, you would expect to have some evidence, somebody noticing some sort of activity that would cause the brutal murder of this entire family so close to where they live. I mean, it's just incredible to me that someone in the area who was present at the time this happened would not have heard something, seen something, noticed something. But apparently that didn't happen here. There are so many weaknesses in the state's case that we could almost spend all afternoon talking about reasonable doubt 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for them to piece it all together at the end and get past that reasonable doubt charge that the judge will give the jury.
Okay, and it's also important to note they did have that surveillance video that you're seeing there of the headlights of that vehicle passing the home the night the family disappeared. But they never bothered to collect any other video from this witness. And you heard her talk about in the testimony how she did have other video there that I guess self-erased after 3 or 4 months. There was a certain amount of time. Is that troubling to you, Marnie Jo?
It's not necessarily troubling, but I think we talked before about how this case is going to be incredibly lengthy. The prosecution is going to put up many, many weeks of evidence. And I think it's really important that the defense be kind of ready for any way that they piece it together. And so I think that it is true that this is compelling and that no one heard anything. We talked before about how it might not be the defense to say that the police didn't do a wonderful investigation, but we know it's going to be a lengthy trial. So it's very important to point out the things that the police didn't recover and the evidence that doesn't now exist, especially in a case where you're pointing to a possible other suspect.
And remember, this, as Paige has mentioned, this is a death penalty case. Okay, let's now turn to testimony from a sergeant who was one of the first investigators at the scene of the home when the family had been reported missing. Take a listen.
What do you do?
Well, then we do what's called a welfare check. I wanted to go in the house, just make sure that there wasn't any sign of, any blood or anything that just stuck out to be abnormal, since we are taking a missing persons of 4, which is not normal. We don't do that very often, should I say. And so I wanted to go in and check and make sure there wasn't anything that we were missing as far as foul play or anything like that. Make sure that if there were people in there, that we could have, helped them if they needed help.
Okay. So what did you do?
We did a walkthrough of the residence, checking each room inside the residence.
You said,
occupants.
I'm sorry. You said we. Did Mr. McStay go with you?
No, he was with me, yes.
Okay. Was it dark yet, or was it still somewhat light out, or?
I believe it was still somewhat light.
Okay. Did you have to turn on lights in the house or use a flashlight?
No, I believe it was light. It was still bright enough for us to not have to do that.
Okay. And as part of that welfare check and cursory search, it wasn't a real in-depth search, was it?
No, we weren't going through drawers or anything like that. We're just basically looking in each room and checking the closet and the bathrooms and things like that to make sure that there wasn't anything that I believed to be obvious signs of struggle. So when we did the walkthrough of the house, I noticed that they weren't fully unpacked. It didn't appear that it was a fully furnished home. It appeared that whoever was there, in my mind, had just got up and left, which didn't seem, just raised suspicion. It didn't seem like that would be something normal. So to cover my bases as far as making sure that we crossed our T's and dotted our I's, I contacted our homicide sergeant, because anything that goes further than 10 days, they receive for follow-up and further investigation. So I wanted to let them know what we had to see if they wanted me to do anything else with the incident, or if they wanted to respond out and assess it.
Okay, so no obvious signs of a struggle, and that sergeant there that you just heard from testifying to the fact it looked like the family had just gotten up and left. Things looked like they had been leaving in a hurry. Paige, how does that square with the prosecution's theory that the murder happened at the home? Because I feel like you can't have both. Either someone left in a rush or someone was murdered at a home. Rarely would you have a scene where you see both, right?
Yes, I suppose they could have been murdered during dinner. I don't know. I mean, the whole thing is really a mess. I mean, to convict someone of murder and then seek the death penalty, your evidence has to be crystal clear beyond a reasonable doubt. The motive has to be crystal clear. How the crime occurred has to be a consistent theory from the state from start to finish, and all of the evidence they have has to fit into that theory. I'm not seeing any of that in this case. Again, I think the only reason we're at trial in this case and this guy's facing a death penalty is because somebody has to pay for this crime. And he, unfortunately, I guess is the most connected to it, the last guy to see or talk to McStay, the one who had some questionable financial motive. But it's way too fuzzy, in my opinion, based on what we've seen so far for a death penalty case.
Marnie, you agree?
Yes, I mean, I absolutely do. I think that, death by juries, people who can be on a jury where they're seeking death penalty, they're more likely to convict, but that doesn't mean they're not taking everything very, very seriously. And I also think the world is changing, and with evidence this thin, I think the jury is not going to want to go forward with something that's hard on them in that same way. And I think they need to concentrate more on motive and proving why this person than proving some of the other stuff and dragging it out. I just don't know that they have their case, and maybe that's why it's taking so long.
Okay, so did someone contaminate the crime scene? That's the question the defense is trying to put in the juror's mind. When we return, we'll take you to some testimony raising that very theory. Stay with us here on Law and Crime. A week after the McStay family went missing, a family friend of Joseph McStay visited the home, and it's what they noticed at the home that raised some eyebrows for the defense. Take a listen.
Walked in, and now, especially because the dog was left there, it was so odd that it just reassured me that this dog goes everywhere with them. And I couldn't believe they were still even behind. And that was just, 2 days before I last saw them. So when I got there, I just was taking maybe a visual picture of what was there and what might be different from when I was there last.
Okay. What was Susan doing when you got there?
When I walked in, Susan, she let me in, and she was cleaning the kitchen.
How would you describe her mental state at that point?
I think she might have been emotional. I mean, she was, cleaning, working at cleaning the kitchen pretty good. And my first comment to her was, I have, the investigators completed their job here, and so, because apparently there's some eggs or something, some food, pre-prep stuff that was left on the counter. I think she told me, and so she was pretty much cleaning it all up.
Were the cupboards and doors and cupboard doors and drawers still out on the island in the floor where you had put in the paint?
Yeah, I believe that everything was still off because I never got back to repainting that. But I did notice tucked underneath, and I don't know if it's some of that tucked in underneath on the island, one of the shelves was the paint pan with the foil lining in it with a paint roller with dry paint, which was odd to me because the reason I told her to put the foil was to clean it up. And why would she just leave it there and for it to be dried up?
Okay, so the family disappears February 4th, 2010, and he is describing, this is Joseph McStay's friend, describing the mother, Joseph's mother, cleaning the house on February 16th. So that's, a good week and a half after the family went missing. And of course, investigators are there. They're letting this happen Paige, does that raise any eyebrows to you as a defense attorney, the fact that the mom was cleaning up the place?
So, I mean, it's certainly possible that she could have removed some potential evidence that may tie Merritt to these murders or may show that the murders were committed there within the house. But it's not that uncommon for a family member, especially one who's obviously distressed about the situation, to try to do something that she perceives as either helpful or trying to return to some sort of normalcy there within the family. So I can understand her trying to do it. I guess I would criticize the investigators for letting her do it or not instructing her to avoid cleaning anything. Sure.
Paige, but because remember, too, this was a day before the search warrants were issued to look at the house, for investigators to go and look in the house. And here you have the mother cleaning up any evidence that could have been there.
I think that's true, but, you know, again, this is the mother, not somebody who's trying to protect Charles Merritt. So I think if she saw anything that was obvious, that could be evidence, she probably wouldn't have cleaned it. She probably would have notified investigators. Now, she's not trained to look for DNA or anything like that, but I doubt that she removed anything that would have been critical to the state's case. It's just hard for me to believe based on what we've seen so far.
True, but at the same time, she might not have known what she cleaned was something that could down the line become critical to the state's case. That's the only flip side to that.
Maybe. There's a lot of could-haves and maybes in this case, and I just think there are way too many of them. And maybe she helped, but I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, you're left with the evidence that you have. And if you don't have sufficient evidence to charge someone in a case like this, especially to ask for the death penalty, then you don't do it. And maybe justice is not served in that way, but justice is also not served if you convict the wrong guy for a crime he didn't commit.
Okay, so let's turn to some testimony from Detective Troy Dougal. And he addressed questions about the mother, Susan, Joseph McStay's mother, potentially tampering with the crime scene. Let's listen to what he said about what happened.
Backing up, I guess, to the 16th, did you receive a call from Susan Blake?
I did.
Okay. And did Miss Blake tell you that she had gone into the Avocado Vista residence?
She did.
And what did she say about that?
That she was in there cleaning up, and Michael had, I don't believe he was in there at the time of the phone call, but she said he had come in and he had taken the computer out of Joseph's office, and I believe MacGyver was with her, helping her clean up and straighten up.
And what did you do after you learned that information on the 16th?
Well, it was disheartening, but it wasn't her fault. So going back to, I'm going to explain from a homicide detective, at no time am I going to get in the family's face and say, you can't, you won't. I'm actually asking them, give me everything you can. Tell me about your son. Tell me about Summer. Tell me about the grandkids. Give me everything. When you're dealing with a missing persons case and the family doesn't yet believe that their loved ones, and nor did I have to believe their loved ones were murdered, they're going to give you all the great stuff. My family's great, Summer's great, Joseph's great, business is perfect, they're wealthy, the kids are a joy. That's what you get. And I know that, and that's fine. And sometime along that interview process over days, I'm going to try to wedge in there and say, I know they're fantastic people, tell me the bad things. Tell me who doesn't like them. Tell me who owes Joseph and Summer money. And that did evolve over time. It took some time. Kind of lost.
Okay, so Paige, what do you make of the detective there's explanation in terms of Susan cleaning the crime scene?
Well, I think it's reasonable. Again, he didn't want to necessarily give instructions to the family. At that point, they really didn't have much evidence to suggest this was a murder. I don't know at what point it became a murder investigation. Perhaps they should have looked at it that way earlier than they did. And you can fault the police for that. But what I really think the prosecution is doing with this evidence is to try to suggest that there was some evidence there that the mother removed. And I don't know that there's anything in this case that supports that inference.
So that's interesting. They're turning this all around, in your opinion. Normally, it would be for the defense to have a field day with, say, hey, listen, this woman went in there and she cleaned things up. But you're actually trying to say, oh, the prosecution is saying the reason there was no evidence there is because the mom cleaned it up.
Exactly. That's how weak I think the prosecution's case is. I mean, they're arguing the absence of evidence is evidence that he did it. I mean, it's incredible to me.
Wow. And that, you know, in terms of prosecutors and techniques, I always think when they go to that, I think it's because they know that they have a stretch of a case or they don't have the real evidence if they have to spend time actually talking about stuff that wasn't there.
Oh, I'm certain they believe that, Rachel. I mean, these folks are very experienced. I'm not even saying they're bad prosecutors. This is just a case that they're stuck with. And what's the alternative? They don't charge anyone for these brutal murders. I'm certain that the family wanted them to proceed, and the prosecutors thought they had enough to go to a grand jury, to get an indictment, and to go to trial. But at the end of the day, I really think they're going through this process recognizing that their case is not nearly as strong as they would like for it to be.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, but when we return, you're going to hear from Charles Merritt himself. He was interviewed by police after the family disappeared, and something he said raised early suspicions. Stay with us here on Law and Crime. Everybody to the Law and Crime Trial Network. We're continuing to look into the McStay family murders case, and we're going to listen to, in a few minutes, some testimony, some recordings from Charles Merritt when he talked to police investigators. Of course, the defense is trying to point the finger at Dan Kavanaugh, one of Joseph McStay's other business associates. But before we get to that part of the police recording, I want to bring in Pate in to discuss something that the prosecution pointed to, that Charles Merritt, during his police interview, referred to the family in past tense, as if they had already passed away, trying to say that this was evidence that he knew that they were gone, that they were murdered, that they were killed. Is that weak?
Yes, in a word. You know, I guess it's somewhat suspicious, but if you're talking about a missing family, referring to them in the past tense is not completely out of the ordinary. And we have to remember his situation at the time. I mean, being a suspect in a multiple homicide like this is not a comfortable position to be in. I mean, we've seen cases where people were convicted after confessing to crimes that they didn't commit. And so for him to say something like that, I don't think is consciousness of guilt. Certainly the state's going to play it up because they have so few cards to play. So I understand the argument. I think it does cause somebody to be suspicious, but enough for evidence of murder? No, I don't see it.
And the defense also pointed out he was just going along with what investigators were saying. They were using the past tense when referring to the family, so he just followed their cues, and that's why he said that. But of course, that's something the prosecutor really hammered on during the opening statements of this trial, saying, why would a guy, a family that just had been missing for a short time, just assume that the family was dead? Okay, so defense also pointing the finger at Dan Kavanaugh, another business associate. Let's listen to some of Charles Merritt police recording when he addresses what happened between Joseph McStay, the victim, and Dan Kavanaugh. Take a listen.
I was building every waterfall all myself, and I was dying. You know, that's what gave me a heart attack, actually. It was because we got really busy last year, and we were just busy. Where's Dan? Dan was the one that he actually, to the best of my knowledge, he owns part of Earth Inspired Products. Joseph was buying him off. Him and Joseph kind of had they weren't real happy together. Or Joseph wasn't real happy having to pay him so much. Do you know what he paid? I have no clue. Joseph didn't tell me a whole lot about it. Have you, Joe, and Dan all lived in the same apartment at one time at the beach? Oh, no, I've never met him. Oh, you've never met him? No, I've never met Dan. The first time I talked to Dan was a week ago or a little less, or when all of this started, Dan called me and said, "Hey, what are we going to do?" I said, "I don't know. I don't have any access to, Joseph's emails. I don't have any access to any of this. I can't help him." And so Dan said, "Well, I can send you any pertinent emails if you can follow up with them. Any complaints, any problems with customers, can you try to deal with them so that when Joseph comes back, at least we've made an effort to, get this stuff taken care of." What date was that?
All right, we're going to probably hear much more about the defense's theory that Kavanaugh was the one that committed these murders when we begin the defense's case. I can't tell you when that's going to be because this trial has been going on for so many weeks. The prosecutors really, I have to say, dragging out their evidence that they are presenting to the jurors. But you heard Charles Merritt get into a little bit of why Dan Kavanaugh might be a suspect according to the defense. I think Marnie Jo Snyder is back on the line with me. There she is. What do you make of the Dan Kavanaugh theory?
I mean, it's going, well, first of all, the defense does not have to prove that Dan Kavanaugh did it and does not have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So I think it's a phenomenal theory for the defense, especially in light of how thin the evidence is. It is never fun, especially when someone's life is on the line, to stand up and say, well, they just don't have enough. It is more compelling, if you can do it, to say, and this is who we think did it, or this is who they didn't investigate well enough and they don't deserve a conviction against my client. So I think it will become very important in this case, even though I do agree that the evidence is really thin.
And Pate, there were some curious withdrawals that went to Dan Kavanaugh after the family disappeared. Does that matter?
It may, but here's where I think the defense needs to be very, very careful. As Marnie Jo pointed out, they have absolutely no obligation to prove that someone else committed this murder. But if they start putting on evidence and they have this theory that somebody else did, the jury may expect them to prove that this other person did it. So you don't, as a defense lawyer, want to take on the burden of actually proving who committed the crime, especially when the state's case is so weak as it is here. So leave it out there. Let the jury think about it. Maybe they have some suspicions.
And Paige, sorry to cut you off. We have to take a quick break. Thanks so much for joining us. I know we're going to say goodbye to you. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with a Daily Debrief.